Well, it's 1 minute past 2:30. I think it's time to get going. Good afternoon and welcome to everyone to our first coaching webinar for 2023. And I know that we're all hoping 2023 is going to be a better year than 2022, but I hope wherever you are, it's already been off to a really great start. Now, a little introduction about Grist first before I jump into who we are and what we're doing today. But at Grist, we're really passionate about simplifying change and inspiring learning so people and organisations thrive. And coaching is a really key component of making learning and change easy and really sustainable. And that's why we've really started these coaching webinars, is to really play into that, how we help your organisation thrive and build sustainable learning culture throughout your organisation. Now, for anyone who hasn't joined our previous webinars, my name's Caitlin Ziegler. I'm a director at Grist, and I'm going to be your MC today. Now, I'm joined by my colleague, Kate Golby, who is our Senior Behavioural Analyst. She is going to be directing a lot of the questions today. And we're also joined by a special guest, Dave McQueen. He is my fellow director and head of sales. Now, Dave's experience ranges not just in sales, but from strategic thinking to right through to in-the-moment mastery of conversation. It's the leaders and the frontline teams and the way that they look after their customers is what really fuels his passion. David is an expert in adult learning principles, and his work across some of Australia's largest organisations. Through that work, he has seen how building capability really delivers business results, plus enormous job satisfaction and pride for individuals. As David himself says, there is no better feeling than being great at what you do. It's not that hard. Little things done well and every day quickly add up to enormous progress. And we're going to hear a little bit more about that today in a second. Now, before I hand over to Kate and Dave to kick off our discussion, just a little bit of housekeeping before we get started. Now, to interact with us, please use the Q&A button on the control panel. By all means, please pop some questions in there and we will have a look at questions at the end of the session. And also make comments if you'd rather, so please do that as well. We'll get to all of these at the end of the webinar, and we've got a couple of other questions that we've had sent in as well. Please don't forget to ask them. Now, I think that that's all we need to do. Please stay on mute as you would for any other webinar, and we'll get into our discussion shortly. Today, we are talking about the Seinfeld strategy. Now, the Seinfeld strategy, Kate, can you tell us what is the Seinfeld strategy all about?
Thanks, Caitlin. Yep. So, I mean, I'm sure there's quite a few avid Seinfeld fans out there, myself included. And when I first heard of the Seinfeld strategy, my mind immediately jumped to, the strategy about nothing. But I was glad to hear that it was a fair bit more useful than that. The story is essentially that Brad Isaac, a budding comedian, once bumped into Jerry Seinfeld at a comedy club, and he just asked him for some tips on how he could be a better comic himself, as he was still, quite young and starting out. Seinfeld's response was pretty simple, and I'll spare you any impressions. I have absolutely no impression skills, so I'm just
impression will be good.
Not even going to try. So basically, Jerry said, the way to be a better comic is to write better jokes. Okay, really helpful, thanks. But the way to write better jokes is to write every day. So Seinfeld suggested getting a big wall calendar that showed the full year on one page and a red texter. And for each day that he wrote, he asked Isaac to mark off with a big X on that day. And then the only other instruction apart from that was to just don't break the chain. So just keep putting that mark of an X every single day, just don't break the chain. And so the Seinfeld strategy was born. Now, it sounds like a pretty simple approach, right? But it worked. And so by focusing on maintaining this chain of writing every day, Brad Isaac was able to consistently produce quality work and avoid procrastination. Now, I'm not sure how many of you guys are budding comedians, but I'm thinking that this approach could probably work for other things as well, right? So maybe to coaching. Dave, how do you think that we could apply this Seinfeld strategy to being a better coach?
Yeah, well, we certainly do love the Seinfeld strategy because it's an easy and clever way to get better at just about anything, right? So, but when it comes to coaching, Kate, there's probably three main ways that we see coaches use this, don't break the chain kind of idea. to get better. So the first one is really around the quantity and frequency of coaching. So, to get good at anything, we need to practice, right? So, typically leader operating rhythms, what we might have an hour per person per month, I think. And many of those coaching sessions end up being cancelled anyway. So, what we tend to find is that coaches that get better quickly, they break that hour into, weekly coaching sessions of about 15 minutes each. And these shorter, more frequent coaching sessions, end up delivering, maybe double or even triple the output of that 1 hour per month, right? So it just 1 hour a month doesn't necessarily end up being enough practice in order to get better. So, no matter how often you're coaching, grabbing a calendar though and making sure that you're doing each of your coaching sessions each week, each fortnight, each month is a great way to stay on track and stop cancelling those coaching sessions so you don't break the chain. The second way that we see coaches using the Seinfeld strategy is around improving the quality of their coaching. So, we've all got things that we want to do to get better at our coaching, right? So maybe it's staying on track, or maybe it's having more natural or conversational style. Maybe it's talking less and asking more questions, or even setting higher quality goals. So, what we see is that coaches that get better quickly, they choose one specific coaching behavior to work on, and they practice that 6 times or 10 times, and they kind of mark it off that they're doing it every single coaching session. And then once they've mastered one, they then choose another coaching behavior, and they kind of repeat the process 6 times, 10 times until they start to master it, and they don't break the chain. So it's a great way to get better that way. And the last way that we kind of see coaches using it is in their actual coaching sessions themselves. So, we all want our people, our coaches, our team members to get better. And so when setting goals, we hear coaches asking things like, so how many conversations in a row would you or do that behavior, or ask that question, or how many days in a row would you do that activity or do that behavior? Yeah. And they start to get the coachee to think about their deliberate practice, their, not breaking the chain and marking it off, and then showing the evidence that they've done it that many times in a row. There's a few ways I think we see coaches use the Seinfeld strategy, Kate.
Yeah, so they're using it for themselves, not breaking their coaching rhythm chain, but then they're also sort of practicing what they preach, I guess, and then helping their coachee to, jump on board with the strategy and use the same techniques, right? Yeah. So I guess application and practice here is the key, but is all practice equal,
Oh, your point, it is all about application and practice, right? So many people think that just re-watching a video or rereading content is kind of enough to get better at something. But in our experience, it's not, yeah? And I've got 2 kids moving into year 11 and 12, and they've got study schedules in place, and they've got the calendar, and they're crossing off each of their study sessions. But what they do in each of those study sessions is incredibly important, right? Just going over their notes, 100 times or rereading a textbook, it just doesn't get their level of mastery up. So they actually, need to do things like they need to practice old exam questions, or get the questions from the start of the year and actually rewrite the answers. And it's that kind of deliberate practice that makes the difference in getting better. And unfortunately, the only way to get better at these things is just to do the reps, right? So to answer your question about is all practice of equal value, well, the answer is no, right? So, it has to be what's called deliberate practice. And, I don't know if you know much about deliberate practice, but it's a technique that was developed by psychologists, Erickson and Moxley, back in the 1990s, right? And it uses repetition and successive refinements to address a specific skill and to increase or enhance performance, right? So, it's got to be, so it's a couple of things that you need to have deliberate practice well. And the first one is it's got to be challenging. The practice has to be challenging. And it's got to push you just beyond your abilities where they are now. And it's called the zone of proximal development, right? And so a coach and their coachee have to work together to go, if we're working on setting the agenda, are you just doing it at a basic level, or are you doing it at a really big mastery level? And wherever you are, you've just got to make that small little improvement to get better from your baseline.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I actually saw an image the other day, and I'll pop it up now. I really just like how it illustrated pretty much exactly what you've just sort of spoken about there, that, you know, that zone of proximal development there. So this ladder, you know, it shows how small steps and, you know, and coaching more frequently builds that behavioral change, and more, you know, more easily and quickly. I guess, you know, that guy on the left there is having a much easier job of it than the guy on the right. And so, yeah, Dave, what do you think? Do you think that aligns with what you were saying about that zone of proximal development?
Yeah, this is a great picture, right? Because, you know, if you think about it like learning an instrument or learning a new language, right? You don't go to playing Beethoven's Fourth Concerto straight away, right? You've got to start with the easier pieces. And then you practice and you make small little changes at the bottom of that ladder on the left, right? And you make changes and you push yourself, but it's safe enough that you don't feel overwhelmed, right? And it's safe enough that you can kind of like win and fail your way and progress. And when you get up to that mastery level, you're still doing the same thing. You're still like making little changes to that performance. I mean, most elite performers follow some type of challenging but not overwhelming kind of training principle, right? I mean, again, there's no other way to do it. You have to just put in the hard yards and do the practice.
Yeah, absolutely. All right. And you sort of it seems like it's about personalizing the practice to where you currently are, right? And you mentioned that there was another element to that deliberate practice. Do you want to just tell us a bit more about that, Dave?
Yeah. You know, the other element is that you've got to make sure it involves ongoing assessment and feedback, right? So challenging practice, but you've got to actually, you know how well you're progressing. So it can be in the form of like self-assessing against a proven framework or a standard, or it can be things like close mentoring or feedback from a boss or a third-party expert, you know, and that's why you kind of want to make those changes really small and specific, so that they can be seen and heard really easily by others, because, you know, when they're that specific, it's much easier for them to give you high quality feedback, right? You know, at Grist, we kind of teach deliberate practice in terms of a learn, practice, feedback loop that's kind of repeated over and over again until we get from our current state, to our desired state, right? And you'll notice with the learn, practice, feedback loops that all the bubbles are kind of the same size. Learn, practice, feedback. It's not like learn is this big bubble that you do 2-3 days, a year of learning, and then do a little bit of practice and a little bit of feedback. No, you know, you do a little bit of learning and then a little bit of practice and you get a little bit of feedback, right? And then you just kind of build your skill slowly and steadily over, you know, from where you are now to where it is you need to be, right? So, you know, typically that feedback part requires, you know, some type of observation to occur, right? But I know that it's not always that easy for leaders to get out and observe their people in action. And so if you can't get out and see your people, then, you know, really the only way to see them do it is to do it in their coaching session and to put them into some type of role play. Yeah, even if it's just a section that you want. But as soon as you see or hear them do that particular behavior or walk you through the example on time management or whatever it is, you, as the leader, as the coach, you immediately know where they're at, right? And that allows you to tailor the action, or to tailor the practice session, to just push them up a little bit more, right? So, you know, if you deliberately practice small and specific, high quality coaching behaviors, and then you combine that with the increased frequency that we were talking about earlier, yeah, your coaching is going to get better, like really quickly.
Yeah, absolutely. So yeah, I really like what you said about the role play being, you know, that really small and specific, you know, just getting to the guts of exactly what we want to practice. But I guess the big question is, you know, how much practice do you actually have to do?
Yeah, it's a big question, isn't it? So in 2008, some of you might know the name Malcolm Gladwell, and he published a book called Outliers. And in this book, he kind of said that it took about 10,000 hours of deliberate practice to become an expert in just about anything. Right? And this whole idea of 10,000 hours swept around the world. Well, I've heard it so often now that I think it's safe to say that it's probably just a common rule of thumb, right? and you can't hear it. You know, it's catchy, it's easy to remember. 10,000 hours. You know, the problem with 10,000 hours in my mind is that, you know, if we think about, you know, us as professional facilitators, right? You know, we would do about 1,000 hours of facilitator in the room a year. So, you know, 10,000 hours roughly translates to about 10 years of practice in order to become an expert at something. And I go, oh, 10, you know, I don't have that much time. You know, I'm 50, I might be not here by then. So, you know, so the question then becomes like, maybe I don't need to be the world's best expert in something, you know, like what does it take to actually just be good, like really good at something? And one of my favorite authors, a guy by the name of Josh Kaufman, he's researched that exact question. And the answer that he's come up with is about 20 hours of deliberate practice. And with that 20 hours, you can actually become pretty good at just about anything. So you imagine 20 hours of practice of playing guitar, you get better at a couple of songs pretty well by doing that. Or playing a didgeridoo, you can master like circular breathing, all that kind of stuff. And when it comes to coaching, you can become, you know, pretty solid coach with 20 hours of deliberate practice, I reckon.
I've got to jump in there because it's a big gap between 10,000 and 20. And even 20 hours is actually quite a big time investment. If we're talking about developing, let's just leave aside the coach for the minute, but if you're going to develop a team member through a week, you're going to have to spend 20 hours out of their week, out of their day, you know, out of their month to really develop them in a new skill. I had actually a question sent in about this earlier. I did mention we had some questions. One was, if we're talking about deliberate practice today, what is really the minimum amount of practice someone can do to get better at a skill? And I do imagine that it depends on the size of the skill, but what does that take, Dave?
Yeah, well, for many years, I would have answered that with about 20 hours of practice. Right? So, you know,
sticking with the 20,
there, an hour a week, you know, or something like that,
yeah.
You know, and kind of get it done. But, you know, just recently, like February of this year, a new study came out by a guy called Ken Codinger and his research team from the Carnegie Mellon University in Pittsburgh in the US. And what it showed was that it took somewhere between 3.6 and 13.6 application events for students learning a knowledge component and a skill to get 80% level of correctness, right? So interestingly, the rate of how students learn, the rate of student learning remained pretty much the same. So intelligence, or it didn't make any difference to the rate of learning. What they found was whether a student required 3.6 practice events or 13.3 practice events actually came down to their previous level of knowledge and expertise in the topic, right? So, but on average, it took 7 deliberate practice events for most people to get to about that 80% level of correctness. And I think for us in the learning game, it has some really interesting implications, right? So firstly, you know, again, it's just more evidence to show that we know that just sending out reminders of content and go, hey, rewatch that video or reread that, it doesn't really have much impact on skill improvement, skill mastery. What it showed that mastery just actually requires application. But the author's conclusion in this study was that mastery is potentially less about the time spent practicing and more about the number of deliberate practice events that occurred. Yeah. So, you know, the question for organizations is, you know, how well are our L&D functions set up to assess up to 13 different practice events? Yeah. So, I mean, unless they're using our friends at YakTrack who do this so well at measuring practice events, you know, there's not too many organizations that we see are great at that. So I think there's still a lot of work for organizations to do to really make sure that their practice events are actually taking place, right? So, you know, Caitlin, rather than giving the answer in I would spent what the minimum number of hours, I go, you know, I'd probably give it to you now in the minimum number of practice events that you need to do to complete it, right?
I kind of like that because you go, 20 hours, I get that's a good yardstick. 20 hours is a nice measure to have. But then 7 practice events, it gives me that flexibility around how big that skill is, I guess. So whether it's big or small, so long as I get those around 7 practice events in, I'm probably going to get through that skill. And that might equate to 20 hours. It might be a bit more, it might be a bit less. It kind of makes sense to me. Really interesting though, Dave, that research showed that the learning rate is actually not that different between all of us. You kind of expect that everyone would have slightly different learning rates, but really interesting insight out of that it's more about that where you start from, where your level of expertise is.
Yeah.
And I also love that as a coach, that gives you a bit of an indication. I know we often see and often say to coaches, don't move on too quickly. And that's almost a little bit of a nice way of indicating you really shouldn't move on until you've made sure that they have practiced it in a really robust way, at least those 7 times, to say that they've achieved that mastery level. I really love that.
How often do we have one coaching session or one meeting and go, right, that's done, you know?
Move on.
To do that, right? Like, you know, without actually going to watch them to do it, how would you know? And then once they're there, how can you push them to do it a little bit harder? Because, you know, you take open questions, for example, right? Oh, I've got to do open questions, and yet they're not all great open questions. You know, like for someone to really ask open question to find out, you know, things like criteria, and then it's different level of mastery to find out open questions that actually find out like emotional drivers and really get down deep within a customer's need, right? So yeah, there's different levels of mastery even within that, right?
Terrific. Well, thank you, Dave, and thank you, Kate. I've got another question for you, Dave, in a second, but before I get to that, I just want to put it out there again, if anyone does have some questions for Dave, please pop it in the chat. I'm monitoring that, and I see we don't have anything at the moment. But Dave, I've got another question for you from our side, and one that is, the Seinfeld strategy is not really the only reason we love Jerry Seinfeld. We also are really big on getting humour into learning. Can you tell us a little bit more about how we are bringing humour into our learning?
Yeah. Well, I think if you think back to your favourite teacher or your favourite boss or whatever it is, you know, our minds often go back to people that you know, made work more enjoyable for us, right? And humour is a proven technique for engaging both our minds and our emotions all at the same time. You know, as I understand it, learning humour has actually been shown to be as effective as repetition for retaining information. So, you know, that's pretty cool. So in COVID, you know, we were forced to change the way we do things. You know, historically, you know, Grist have been a specialist in face-to-face training, and I mean, one of the reasons that we didn't get into online kind of virtual training for a long time was because it was so passive, right? Like this is one-way learning experience of this self-paced kind of learning, and you know, we didn't really love it, right? And it certainly wasn't really great compared when it had to do the application and the opportunity to practice new skills and building mastery. But you know, online learning is here to stay, and you know, there are many benefits of it for both hybrid and remote working workforces. So we thought if we're going to do it, we've got to do it our way. Right? So we approached Shane Jacobson and some of his team to go, hey, what could you do to bring some of our content to life in a really like light-hearted and fun approach to learning without actually losing any of the effectiveness of application, right? And so what we came up with was we produced our video series of our 2 coaching programs. And it's the very best of our coaching micro behaviors packed into 32-minute videos. And they're presented by Shane Jacobson, Pia Miranda, and Stephen Hall, and their gold. So you kind of get the best of both worlds, right? You got coaching content written by experts, but delivered by Australia's best comedians and storytellers. And you know, the results are actually pretty impressive. Like, not only do people watch them, they have higher levels of recall of the behaviors, but the biggest transformation happens when these coaches do an audio recording of their coaching conversations and then self-assess it against the framework, right? And the impact of doing that's amazing. These small and immediate changes that they do. And so, I mean, we've set it up so they can do between 4 and 13 separate self-assessments, right? So each time they listen and they make an additional small change to the way that they coach, and the result is just speed to confidence, right? You know, the coaches feel better about their coaching. More importantly, potentially, is that the people they're coaching feel better. They're getting more value. from the coaching sessions that they're having with their leaders. So that's great. You know, it's kind of exciting.
It is exciting. And for those of you out there who haven't seen our GIST platform, Kate, I'll get you to put up that last couple of slides. This is essentially what it looks like. And as Dave said, a little 1-minute summary of what we have in our GIST platform. As you said, the coaching models, both ACDC and Tactical Grow, you can learn the model on the platform. It's all through little tiny short videos, little micro bites of learning that you move through. And then as you move through the learning the model, you get your practice events in. So there's that self-assessment that then really tracks your how you're tracking against those behavioural measurements of the coaching. And you can see here, you've got a little graph of how often I demonstrate those key coaching behaviours that get tracked all in the platform as well. So you get the best of both worlds, the humour and then the deliberate practice on the back of that as well. And if you'd like to know more about that, or if you have further questions about anything we've spoken about today through the webinar, please get in contact. We really welcome your questions and we would love to talk to you further if you would like to know more. But that is pretty much all we have time for today. I would love to just thank both Kate and Dave for jumping on today and taking us through that discussion, really robust discussion on practice and the Seinfeld strategy. It was lovely to hear some different techniques and some really nice things that even I will be taking out the not breaking the chain on with the Seinfeld strategy. I would also like to say to all of you, if you do want to dig deeper and have a look at some of our past coaching webinars, they are all available on our website. So you can jump into our news section and you can see, and the events section if you want to see what's coming up as well. We have all our webinars scheduled for the year. We'll be continuing this throughout the year, this new format of sort of interviewing a different coach each month or each couple of months as we run these webinars. So please do subscribe to our newsletter or have a look online on our website and you can register for those webinars coming up as well. Our next webinar, we have a really special guest, a senior leader from an insurance company who is going to take us through just her approach to coaching and how it's how she's changed some of her coaching and using that frequent, short, sharp approach as well and how it's worked for her team. So thank you everyone for joining us today, and Kate and Dave, always a pleasure to be talking to you both, and thank you for jumping on and joining us. We will see you next time.
Thanks, Caitlin.
Thanks everyone.